Hi everyone, welcome to Miss Adams Teaches Macbeth. In this session, we are going to be looking at the character of Macbeth and how he changes and develops throughout the play. Each slide on this video will give you an aspect of his character and some key quotations to go with it. So it's really great to help you put together a bank of useful quotations for you to memorise for that GCSE exam. I'll also help you out with a little bit of analysis, so identifying features of language structure and form, and where applicable, I will relate it to context as well, so we can hit all of those assessment objectives. So without further ado, let's start learning about Macbeth and how his character develops. Okay, starting from the top, one of the first things that you need to be aware of when studying the change in the development of Macbeth is how Shakespeare plays around with the conventions of tragedy. So one of the things that makes this play tragic is the fall from grace of our hero. So Aristotle's conventions of tragedy give us some sort of rules, some specific rules for what a tragic hero should be. One of the things that a tragic hero should be is noble and good, as well as having high status at the very beginning of the text. So when we first meet Macbeth through the eyes and opinions of others in Act 1, Scene 2, Shakespeare is presenting him at the pinnacle, at the top of his journey. So here are a couple of quotes to help back that up. So when they're talking about his fighting prowess, they say, "For brave Macbeth, well he deserves that name, disdaining fortune with his brandished steel, which smoked with bloody execution, like valour's minion carved out his passage till he faced the slave." That's a very long quote. Obviously, if you were trying to memorise parts of it, you might just look at little sections. But it's a really good quote at demonstrating what a powerful warrior he is. Now, that is part of the tragic hero status because he's doing it for King Duncan. This warrior status proves his loyalty to the king, proves how good he is. He's got all of these qualities that people admire. For example, we've got the adjective brave, and then his courage re-emphasized in this parenthesis, well, he deserves this name, justifying the adjective itself. We've also got this wonderful personification where it talks about, the captain talks about Macbeth disdaining fortune. Disdaining means to scorn or to sort of look down on. So it's like saying, well, he doesn't need luck. He doesn't need to have something else on his side. He uses skill, his brandished steel. So imagine that sword being wielded around. Look at this metaphor. It's smoked with bloody execution. So he's an extraordinary fighter, fast and skilled. Now we've got a simile, like valour's minion. Okay, so like almost like the soldier of bravery. He carves out his passage, another metaphor, until he faced the slave being the enemy in this moment. So this quite brutal image of him physically chopping his way through all of the soldiers to get to the point where he is fighting King Duncan's enemy. All of this is elevating him, raising his status up and reminding us that he is considered the absolute best of the best at this moment. Duncan, King Duncan, backs this up with this exclamative here, "O valiant cousin, worthy gentleman." Now this is really important because if Shakespeare hadn't presented him early on as having this great high noble status, well, that arc, that development wouldn't be as great. So he starts him up here so that he can then bring him down by the end of the play. So one point you can make is that he is a tragic hero as per Aristotle's conventions. However, that's not to say that there aren't some early hints of darkness. So you've got two quotes here. Only one of them is said by Macbeth. The first quote, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen," that's Macbeth's first line of the play. It's in Act 1, Scene 3, when we meet him for the first time. Now, that might seem like a fairly standard thing to say. He's saying, you know, that this is a day that is both dreadful and brilliant all at the same time. That's fair enough. However, I'm going to sneeze, excuse me. Sorry. However, what creates this little hint of darkness is the fact that it echoes the witches' lines from Act 1, Scene 1, where they say fair is foul and foul is fair. So we've got this incredible repetition, this antithesis. It sounds very chant-like. The witches are telling us that what seems to be bad or what seems to be good is potentially evil, and vice versa. The fact that Shakespeare has Macbeth echo these lines, repeat the adjectives, and that startling juxtaposition is telling us, well, he is linked to the witches, or he is similar to the witches. So either way, it's a little hint to the audience who, of course, from a context perspective, were very frightened of witches. King James was very frightened and concerned by witches. It's saying, hang on a minute, watch out. Maybe not everything is as it seems. Okay, so we learn that Macbeth has some pretty early ambitions. So after he has had the prophecies given to him about becoming king, and then he finds out that the second of them has come true, obviously the first is true already because he already is Thane of Glamis, when he discovers that he's going to be the Thane of Cawdor, he says in an aside, okay, so only we, the audience, can hear his thoughts, two truths are told as happy prologues to the swelling act of the imperial theme. This is a really powerful metaphor. The two truths that he's referring to are those first prophecies, Thane of Glamis, which he already was, and Thane of Cawdor, which he's just been awarded. And he sees them as happy prologues. So that adjective tells us a lot. For this noun here, also a metaphor, prologues, a prologue is the bit at the beginning of a story, isn't it? So he's basically saying, oh yeah, there's more to come. And you can see that through this adjective, the swelling act, the building. He's expecting more to come. The swelling act of the imperial theme. So of the imperial theme, of the kingly theme. So in his brain, immediately he's going, okay, two of these three things have come true. What's next? What's next? Kingship. Okay, so lovely metaphor there. Little bit of meta-narrative here, where we're sort of drawing attention to the fact that it is a play through language to do with performance. Now, the very next scene, Act 1, Scene 4, we have this moment. So after Duncan, King Duncan names his son as the Prince of Cumberland, i.e. the next in heir to the throne, in line to the throne, he says, the Prince of Cumberland, that is a step on which I must fall down or else overleap, for in my way it lies. So powerful. You can see the intensity of him through that exclamative here. But what's more interesting is where his brain goes. He dehumanizes Malcolm, Duncan's son, by referring to him with these pronouns. That is a step, not he is a step. The fact that he uses the metaphor of a step, again, is quite dehumanizing. And again, he uses the third person pronoun it rather than he. So that immediately shows us that he's kind of trying to take a distance from him as a human, because already he sounds like he's plotting. Now, you might say, well, what's that got to do with ambition? It's because it's ambition driving him. Immediately, he's thinking, how am I going to get to be king? How am I going to do this? Oh, right, well, I'm going to need to get rid of the Prince of Cumberland. Now, if you want some nice terminology here, going back to the idea of tragedy, Aristotle said that our tragic hero had to have some kind of flaw, a tragic flaw that would bring about his downfall. This is called a hamartia, H-A-M-A-R-T-I-A, hamartia. And here we see what Macbeth's hamartia is. It's his ambition. So if you get a question on Macbeth and his character and his presentation or development, hamartia needs to be discussed. Okay, another aspect of his personality that's really important, especially if you're going to look at the way that it changes, is Macbeth as the loving husband. In the early parts of the play, particularly in Act 1, Scene 5, we see how much love he has for Lady Macbeth. Now, this little quote comes from the letter that he writes her. So we actually see this as Lady Macbeth reads the letter aloud on stage. He says, "This have I thought good to deliver thee, my dearest partner in greatness, that thou mightst not lose the dews of rejoicing." So if we look at this bit, he's like, okay, well, I want to tell you this because I don't want you to miss out on any of the excitement. I want you to know about it. Okay, so that's nice. Yeah, that shows love. And you've also got this lovely bit here where he calls her my dearest partner in greatness. So this is lovely, little superlative, dearest partner. And the noun partner is lovely as well because it's showing that he sees her as an equal. Now, bearing in mind the time that we're looking at, marriages for love weren't that common. So actually, this relationship feels quite special because he really does love her and he sees her as his equal, whereas most people would assume that the wife would be subservient. But there's something else going on here as well. In this letter, he tells her everything that the witches have said, absolutely everything. And those thoughts and those feelings are treasonous in themselves. That shows that he really trusts her. He trusts her with the darkest of secrets. So yes, loving husband, Act 1, Macbeth is. But is he also a controlled husband? Because actually, again, very unusual for the Jacobean era, it is Lady Macbeth that seems to have all of the power in their relationship. She certainly knows how to push his buttons, and she certainly knows how to get him to do what she says. So here is an example of her using kind of gender kind of stereotypes of the time. She says, "When you durst do it, then you were a man." Now, this is her talking about killing Duncan. So she's saying here, when you were talking about killing Duncan, then I saw you as a man because you were brave and you were courageous and you were doing everything that I thought you should do. The implication being, now that you're saying you don't want to do it, well, then you're not a man. So that's a very, very powerful way of manipulating him because it plays on all of the things that he's known for, his bravery, his courage, his masculinity. So she knows quite how to press those buttons. Now look at this bit. To the line before, Macbeth says, "If we should fail," and her response, "We fail? But screw your courage to the sticking place and will not fail." It's actually a shared line when you see it with Macbeth, so it sort of shows their togetherness in this moment. But look at her disbelief in this little rhetorical question. We fail? Not a chance, she's saying. Screw your courage to the sticking place. Notice that use of imperative there, again telling him what to do. And will not fail. This is a lovely metaphor. The sticking place is a reference to when you have a bow and arrow and you pull back. It's that little moment before you let go. So it's a great metaphor to use in this moment because it's about courage and determination, but it also hints to violence as well. So yeah, it would appear that Macbeth is perhaps controlled. However, before you get down into a kind of, oh, Lady Macbeth, she's so awful, you've also got to remember that the reason she's doing this is to try and help him succeed. It's not for her, it's for him. Okay, now, post-death of Duncan, one of the things that we see in Macbeth's character is his guilt. It's important to signpost that this is in Act 2, still quite early doors, and that guilt will soon start sort of disappearing as we go through. So straight after, when he comes back down to see Lady Macbeth in Act 2, Scene 2, having just killed Duncan, he says, "Methought I heard a voice cry, sleep no more, Macbeth does murder, sleep, the innocent sleep." So powerful because sleep is obviously all to do with that kind of sense of peace and restoration, and he's saying that he will no longer ever have that again. Now, this personification that Macbeth is murdering sleep again demonstrates that he knows that it's all on him. He's done this to himself. And the fact that he personifies sleep as being innocent is a reminder of what he's done to Duncan, who is of course an innocent man in all of this. This metaphor then gets extended. If you want a little bit more detail, go and have a little look at my video on Act 2, Scene 2, which picks apart this moment in a lot more depth. Another sign of his guilt is again in the same scene, Act 2, Scene 2, where Lady Macbeth has gone to put the daggers back in the scene of the crime, and he's left alone, and he looks at his hands and he says, "What hands are here? Ha! They pluck out mine eyes." So he's so horrified, he almost imagines himself ripping his own eyes out because he can't bear to see the blood on his hands any longer. And then he extends this. "Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hands?" So note the hyperbole there in this rhetorical question. He imagines that all of the seas in the world, all of the seas under Neptune, god of the ocean, would not be able to rid him of this blood. So it's a massive sign of his early guilt. So earlier in this scene, I said that Macbeth was a loving husband and that their relationship seemed quite unique for the time period that they were in. Now, as the play progresses, you definitely see a cooling of the relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, leaving me to wonder if he becomes more dismissive as he gets more and more caught up in his murderous ways. So the first quote that I want to draw your attention to is, "Be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck." Now, you might think to yourself, well, that's quite sweet, he's calling her a little pet name. But what's most important is that he's talking about the murder, or the soon-to-be murder, of Banquo. But he doesn't give Lady Macbeth any details. Lady Macbeth says, "Well, what are you planning? What are you thinking?" And he's like, no, you don't worry about it. I'm not going to tell you. I'll tell you later. I'll tell you so that you can applaud the deed. I'll tell you afterwards. In that scene early in Act 3, she also says, you're spending a lot of time alone. There's a sense that there's an isolation growing between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. He certainly stops confiding in her, and he certainly stops asking for her help. When Lady Macbeth dies in Act 5, there's a lot of different, there are different interpretations of these words. But Macbeth learns that the Queen is dead. And he says, "She should have died hereafter," i.e. she should have died later. You can read that as being quite dismissive. You can read that as, this is inconvenient that she has died. You can read that as, well, she was going to die at some point, which also sounds dismissive. However, if you are feeling a little bit more sympathetic towards him, you can read it slightly differently. She should have died hereafter. There would have been time for such a word. I.e., I can't grieve her now. It would have been better had she died later, so that I would be able to grieve in the way that she deserves. All plausible? You make up your mind. But there is no doubt that this team, this partnership that we have at the very beginning of the play, by midway through, by Act 3, that has dissolved and they become more and more isolated from one another. But soon this changes. And as he gets further and further into his murderous ways, he becomes more and more tyrannical. Later on, towards the beginning of Act 4, Scene 1, once he has seen the witches, he makes a plan. Having been told to be careful of Macduff, he says, "The castle of Macduff I will surprise, seize upon Fife, give to the edge of the sword his wife, his babes, and all the unfortunate souls that trace him in his line." He knows Macduff isn't at that house. He knows that he's not going to kill Macduff. He is literally there to kill his family. He is punishing Macduff in the worst way possible. And the fact that he wants to eradicate all of the unfortunate souls that trace him in his line belies his own insecurities and fears. He wants Macduff to suffer in the same way that he is, not having a line. This is later on in Act 5. This is actually one of the moments where he is fighting. And he says, "Where I see lives, the gashes do better on them." So it's a sign very different from Macduff, who is also, in the castle trying to find him, who says he doesn't want to kill anyone. He only wants to kill Macbeth. Here, Macbeth is saying, I don't care who it is. I don't care who they are. If they're alive, I'll kill them. So we can see how kind of violent he's become, and how that kind of sense of humanity or awareness of the humanity of others has sort of disappeared. Another thing to look at in Macbeth is his overconfidence. And again, if you want a nice bit of vocabulary that ties in again to Aristotle's conventions of tragedy, you could use the word hubris, Hubris, which means extreme pride or overconfidence, that comes before a fall. And one of the things that incites this hubris, or creates or sparks this hubris or overconfidence, is the witches and their prophecies. So they say, "Be bloody, bold, and resolute, laugh to scorn the power of man, for none of woman born shall harm Macbeth." So you've got this wonderful triad here: bold, bloody, bold, and resolute, with some really nice plosive alliteration in the beginning, telling him that he can do whatever he wants, essentially. He can be as bold, as sort of almost carefree with his violence, because nothing is going to harm him. He's told that no one that was born by a woman can ever hurt him. So this means that he becomes so overconfident because he genuinely thinks that he is invincible, that no one can kill him. And we see this in Act 5, where he says, "I cannot taint with fear." Note the way through this metaphor that he sees fear as some sort of corruption. What's the boy Malcolm? Was he not born of women? So these two rhetorical questions demonstrate that overconfidence. He's not considering Malcolm as any kind of threat whatsoever because he was born of woman. But as the scene progresses, we do see a more nihilistic part of Macbeth. He says, "I begin to be aweary of the sun and wish the estate of the world were now undone." So this is a really interesting moment where he seems to be tiring of life. Nihilism is that, tired of life and the original belief systems you once had. It's a loss of faith. Now you might be thinking, well, how does that tie in here? And it's this homonymic pun. Fancy homonymic pun. You can just say pun if you want. Because although this means I begin to be aweary of the sun, as in life, as in the daily sun, day, night, and you can take that as saying I begin to be weary of life, I want to die. But sun also sounds like sun, S-O-N, and the sun was actually meant to be like a symbol for God, and then obviously it links to Jesus, the Son of God. So he could be saying I begin to be weary of life, but he could also be saying, I begin to be weary of God, i.e. I've lost my faith system of everything, which is what makes him seem nihilistic. And he's basically saying here that he just wishes that it was all over, that all of the world and the order of the world was no more. Likewise, shortly after, he says, "I have lived long enough. My way of life has fallen into the sear, the yellow leaf." So this is an image, a very natural image, an autumnal image, this idea of growing closer and closer to the end of the kind of natural cycle of life, the fact that the leaf, this metaphor, is yellow. It's this idea that he recognizes that he is coming towards the end. Okay, so the last thing that I wanted to talk to you about is the way that the play ends in terms of tragedy. So, as you know, Shakespeare used some of Aristotle's conventions of tragedy in setting up Macbeth as a tragic hero in the early parts of the play. Now, one of the things that Aristotle said was that actually, by the end of the play, the tragic hero should have a bit of an awareness of where they went wrong, and in some way should kind of revert to their previous sense of self. Now, this is after Macbeth discovers that he's been hoodwinked by the witches and he knows that he's in trouble. And he says, "Ring the alarm bell, blow wind, come rack, at least we'll die with harness on our back." This rhyming couplet is so powerful because it kind of reminds us of the old Macbeth, that brave, noble warrior. Because earlier in the act, he had been saying that he wasn't going to fight. He was just going to sit tight and let them, let them sort of starve, trying to, sit outside the castle, stay in the siege, etc. And now that he realizes that actually the end is near, he's like, no, I've got to go back. I've got to be who I was. At least we'll die with harness on our back, meaning wearing their armor. So there's this kind of like drive forward right at the very end. Whether or not he feels remorse for what he's done is another matter entirely. Okay, so probably more than you need for an essay in GCSE sort of timed conditions, but hopefully it gives you a little bit of food for thought and some assistance on selecting some of those really useful sort of high frequency, high money quotations. Make your little flashcards out of them. If you've got any questions about any of the quotations or any contextual information or any analytical information, then just pop them in the comments for me. If you haven't subscribed already, please do so, because then you'll find out when the other videos are coming along, videos on other characters and big themes. We'll do similar things, taking you through some of those fundamental quotations. Thank you so much for watching. Happy revising.